Welcome, my name is Omar Khan. I'm a group program manager in the Visual Studio product team. We're going to be basically spending the next hour taking a look at some of the new features in ASP.NET 3.5 and also Visual Studio 2008, specifically focused around web development. This is a repeat session. I did a part 1 and a part 2 previously on Monday and Tuesday. What I'm going to try and do, since this is the last session of the day, is I'll kind of get through as much stuff as possible in part 1. If people are interested, I can go over a little bit and cover some of the elements from part 2 as well, in case you were not able to attend the part 2 of the session. The goal for today is going, yeah. There's no repeat plan for a part 2, and so I'll try and cover as much of part 2 today. You know, there's some slides. What I'll do is I'll try and skip over the slides and just go straight to the demo, because I know people like to see the demos, so I'll try and do some of the demos from part 2. So the goal for today is, you know, like I was talking, it's to cover the new features in IIS, ASP.NET, and Visual Studio. It's primarily a demo-driven talk. Since it's a small group, I encourage everyone to ask questions as I'm demoing or talking about stuff. We can definitely go ahead and cover those things along the way as well. You know, since this is the last session, I'm more than willing to stick around and answer any questions anybody might have. In the course of the session, what we're going to do is we're going to build an application from scratch. And the goal of that is to just kind of give you a broad understanding of the big new features that we're adding to the tool set and also for the framework. So at a high level, just to take a look at what will be covered in part 1 is the new multi-targeting features in the Visual Studio IDE. What multi-targeting lets you do is move forward to using a new Visual Studio IDE, but still keep your application running on an existing version of .NET. And that's one of the things that we've never had in the past, because you've always had to move to a new version of the framework when you want to use a new version of Visual Studio. So it's a very handy feature which lets you take advantage of all the new features we have in Visual Studio, but still keep your application running on .NET 2.0. Other features that we're going to cover is the new design surface in Visual Studio. We have some really nice features in the design surface around CSS and generating clean code, and we'll be taking a look at how you can do that. We're also going to be looking at improvements in data access. Data access is probably the biggest thing, or the most common thing that's done in web applications. And there's some new technology, specifically LINQ and LINQ to SQL, that let you map relational to object. It's a relation to object data mapping. And both of those are things that are very useful when doing data access in your applications. And then finally, we'll be talking a little bit about new ASP.NET controls that tie into data. Specifically, there's a list view control, which is very nice. And then there's also a linked data source and a data pager that work with all the data-bound controls in ASP.NET. And I'll also cover a little bit some of the new AJAX controls that shipped previously with ASP.NET AJAX 1.0 and are now included in ASP.NET 3.5. In the part 2 of the talk, what is covered is basically IntelliSense and editor improvements around JavaScript. I'll try and cover that today, but I may not go through all the slides for that, so people get a sense of what's available there. We also take a look at kind of the features in ASP.NET AJAX and how they integrate into Visual Studio, and then improvements in the IIS 7 space. In the interest of time, I probably won't be able to get to the IIS 7 stuff, but I'll try and cover some of the part 2 topics in this session. So the first thing that kind of wanted to cover is multi-targeting. I was talking about it earlier. This is probably one of the most, I would say, probably under-touted features in Visual Studio 2008. It's very, very useful to be able to use a new IDE and take advantage of things like the new editor, the new JavaScript support, but not have to move your application or migrate your application to a new version of .NET. And you know, I know that that can be a time-consuming process in terms of upgrading your application. And one of the nice things with Visual Studio now is that we give you the choice of whether you want to do that or not, but you can still take advantage of Visual Studio 2008. So how does it work? When you're creating a new application, you have a choice of what framework you want to target. Similarly, if you're just going to go ahead and open an existing project or an existing solution file, what Visual Studio will do is it will ask you if you want to upgrade that application to 3.5, or if you wish to continue to target the .NET Framework 2.0, if that's what it was built against. So you kind of have that choice when opening existing applications. So what does that decision do then? What it does is it basically then tells Visual Studio to go ahead and filter the options that are available in the IDE so that you're only presented with the options that are relevant to the framework that you're targeting. As an example, the toolbox will only show controls that are relevant to the framework you're targeting. The IntelliSense will only show IntelliSense that's relevant to the framework that you're targeting. And similarly, the references and the add item dialogues will also be filtered to only show the items that are relevant to the framework that you're targeting. So let's go ahead and take a look at how that actually works in the IDE. So I'll just switch over to the product here. Okay, so I have Visual Studio open. What I'm going to do now is you can go ahead and just create like a new website, for instance. And what you'll notice is that in this dialog, what we provide now is an option here to choose which framework you would like to target. So you can go ahead and pick .NET 2.0 if that's the framework that your servers have deployed, or you can go ahead and pick .NET 3.5. You'll notice that when I change the setting, a set of new templates show up. So we basically have the capabilities and technologies that are available in each framework filtered by that option that you choose. So you can go ahead and pick which framework you want to target and then go ahead and use the template that you want to build. So this here I'm showing is the new website dialog, which allows you to create a website that's dynamically compiled by ASP.NET. People may also be familiar with another template that we have in the new project dialog, which is basically called an ASP.NET web application. And the distinction between those two is that one of the website project type is dynamically compiled. It doesn't have a project file. The web application project type basically is a full project file-based project and fully integrates with MS Build. So you kind of have the choice of whichever style you prefer to code in. The ASP.NET web application was added as a feature in Service Pack 1 for Visual Studio 2005. It's now directly integrated into Visual Studio 2008, so it's available right out of the box. And just as well here, you can go ahead and choose which framework you want to target, and it will give you different templates according to that. So let's start off by actually just picking an application and targeting .NET Framework 2.0. So we can go ahead and create that, and what this is going to do is it's just going to create me an application that looks very familiar to the kinds of applications that you might be used to creating in Visual Studio 2005. You pretty much have a standard web form here that it starts with. And then if we go ahead and take a look at web.config, you can see that the options available in web.config are pretty standard. We don't really have any extra settings beyond the simple imports that you would want in your ASPX pages. So if we go back to the ASPX page, you can also see that in the toolbox, you're pretty much going to see the same control set that was available in Visual Studio 2005. So intentionally, because I've chosen .NET 2.0 as a target, the experience that Visual Studio is providing me is filtered to be very familiar to what is available in ASP.NET 2.0 today. You can go ahead at any time in a web application or a web project, just go to the properties and choose to target or upgrade your application to a newer version of the framework. So if I go to the Compile tab here, and then just take a look at the advanced options, what we can see is there's a little drop down at the bottom, and that allows me to reconfigure my application to target a newer version of the framework. So let's just go ahead and target .NET Framework 3.5. And when I go ahead and do that, it's going to go ahead and update some files, and it's going to reopen the project for me. So initially, it looks the same, but if we dig in a little bit deeper, we can see some of the changes that were made as part of that action. So let's start off by going to the web.config. You can see that now we're adding additional configuration in here that's required by ASP.NET 3.5. We're configuring some settings for system web extensions, which enable AJAX capabilities inside of your application. You can also see that we're adding a reference to some new assemblies that are available in .NET 3.5. System.core provides capabilities around link, and system.web.extensions also provides capabilities around AJAX. So these are new assemblies that are available in .NET 3.5, and we add those references in for you in the web.config. Similarly, if we scroll further down, you can see that we're also referencing a new compiler. And basically, what we want to do here is then when ASP.NET compiles the pages in your application, we want it to use the new compilers available in the new framework. So if you go ahead and take a look at the version of the compiler, the web config is now compiling using the VB compiler that's available in .NET 3.5. So Visual Studio kind of handles setting up the web.config file for you as you choose the framework that you want to target. The other thing we can go ahead and look at is a web form here. And what you'll notice now is that the toolbox is also showing some additional controls. So one thing you wasn't there in the previous example was the AJAX extensions category. And since this is built into .NET 3.5, now Visual Studio is showing these additional controls that you can go ahead and use in your application. As well, in the data tab, you'll notice that there's a list view control, which is new. So if I hover over that, you can see the version of that is .NET 3.5. And the old controls are there as well because they're also available in 3.5. So any new controls that ship with the framework, once you target 3.5, the toolbox goes ahead and shows that to you. Similarly, because the references are referencing the 3.5 framework now, all the IntelliSense in the project will show you the options that are available there. One last thing I want to show around multi-targeting is if I can go ahead and add a new item, we'll notice that there's some additional templates as well that now show up, and these are all things that you can do in .NET 3.5. So basically, the multi-targeting feature really gives you the flexibility to take advantage of Visual Studio 2008, but not have to upgrade your application. But if you do want to go ahead and take advantage of the new features in .NET 3.5, those are also available through just selecting the right target. So it's a really handy feature that we didn't have in the past, and I think is going to be very useful for developers. So just switching back to the slides real quickly. So that was, sorry. Okay. So that was multi-targeting. The next thing I want to talk about and spend a little bit of time on is the new design surface that we have in Visual Studio in 2008. And this is a really big improvement over what we've had in the past. We made some great strides between Visual Studio 2003 and Visual Studio 2005 in terms of preserving your formatting and preserving your white space when going to design view and making edits, and that in itself was a very big improvement. But the code that the design surface generated still was not completely deterministic, is the way I would describe it. You know, as I was maybe resizing an image or setting a background color in the design surface, it's not very apparent whether that's going to create an inline CSS style, whether that's going to create an attribute like a width attribute or a height attribute, or if it's going to create an external style and apply a class to that element. And that's one of the reasons primarily why people shy away from using the design surface in HTML is that there's typically many ways to do the same effect, and what the design surface generates may not be always what you want. And what we've done in Visual Studio 2008 is we've integrated a brand new design surface from the ground up. And it's a completely new design surface that's shared with the Expression web product. And it gives you some great feature benefits. So we have things like support for nested master pages. We have things like a support for a split view, which you didn't have with the existing design surface in Visual Studio 2008. And around CSS, we have a lot of support around really giving the end user a lot of control about how the code is going to get generated when they're manipulating elements on the design surface, and I'll be covering that in some detail. The other benefit that you get from this is that because we're sharing the design surface with the Expression web product, there's a great developer-designer interaction that gets enabled by that. Any support that we have for ASP.NET styling or ASP.NET control manipulation in the design surface, that immediately becomes available in the Expression web product as well. So if you have designers working with you, they can go ahead and manipulate those ASP.NET elements the same as a developer can in Visual Studio. And likewise, all the design features that a designer might go ahead and add to your web form, you'll get the full rendering for those inside of Visual Studio. So sharing the design surface definitely has its benefits in terms of enabling a smooth workflow between the Expression Web and Visual Studio product line. So without further delay, let's go ahead and go back to the product and take a look at how that works. So I'm going to go ahead and, actually, let's just switch back for a second. There's one thing I want to talk about. So one of the things that typically, a developer might start off with is a static site design. If you're working with a designer, what they might do is go ahead and mock up what a website might look like. They may even come up with a static HTML representation of what that might look like. And then a developer's job usually is to go ahead and make that interactive, integrate data, integrate some functionality from the back end. And so what I've done for this particular example is I just went to an internet website. There's several of these that are available on the internet where you can go ahead and find free site designs. And so to start with our application, what I'm going to do is I just picked this terra firma design here. We can actually go ahead and take a look at what it looks like. And this is basically a static HTML site design. So it's just a nice design that gives me a 2-column layout with navigation on top and a header and a footer. So pretty standard stuff. It's standard HTML and CSS. And what we want to do is we want to go ahead and take the static site design as a starting point and then use Visual Studio to add interactivity and data into the application. So that's where we're going to start with. And let's go ahead and move over to Visual Studio and see how we can work with that. So I'll go ahead and open up the application which I've created based on that static site template. And one of the first things you want to do is you want to probably kind of create a reusable layout that all of your pages can go ahead and use without having to go edit each individual page to get that benefit. And the feature that is available in ASP.NET to do that is master pages. And so people are probably familiar with master pages. If you're not, it allows you to go ahead and define a part of a document that's going to get reused as a template or an inheritance for all the other forms in your application. So if we go ahead and go to kind of the default page, we can see kind of what I'm talking about here, which is that what we want to do is we want to just take all of the content that is in the center part of the document and define that as a content that each page can go ahead and override. And we want to take the header and footer and basically define that as a master page that then the rest of the application can go ahead and use. So what I did is I went ahead and created a site master page. And if we look at the site master page, all it's done is it's basically taken the content in the middle there and defined a content area. And we've taken the top and bottom and basically said that's the master page template that we're going to apply to the entire site. And the benefit being then that I can just make an edit in one place and the rest of the application and all the pages that are using this master page are going to go ahead and pick up those edits. So one of the things we can show immediately is that we have a split view. So if I go ahead and make some room here and just click the split, we can see that now in Visual Studio you can both see your design and your source at the same time. And that's a very, very useful feature because I know a lot of people spend most of their time in the source editor, but you're constantly switching back and forth to get a preview of what the edits that you're making might look like. We also have some other nice things where you can go ahead and select stuff, and you can see that we're tracking selection across the two views. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and just make an edit here, and we'll just call this TechEd 2007. And then I can go ahead and click back in the design view, and you can see that it updates. So basically, the two views kind of track to each other, and it's a very useful kind of mode to be working in if you're making a lot of source edits, but you quickly want to see a preview of what you're getting. So the split view is very handy in doing that. So one interesting thing with this design was that you saw that there was a 2-column layout where basically there was a main content in the left and then there was another layout on the right. And what I might want to do is actually create a couple of different layouts for my pages in my site. So I might want a 1-column layout and I might want a 2-column layout. There's several ways of achieving that. one way you can do it is you can go ahead and each individual page just define the single column or the two columns. But the nice thing about master pages is then you can go ahead and nest another master page here, one that defines a single column layout and one that defines a two column layout, and then have individual pages use that nested master page as the basis for the content that they will provide. So that's exactly what I've done here. So what we can look at now is, go ahead and save that out. Let's first look at this file called single.master. And you can see that the single.master is another master page, but what it does is it uses the site master that I just showed as the basis for its master page. And if you go to design view, we can see that all this is providing is a single column layout. So this is basically saying that for that content area that was defined in the master page, we're just going to add a div and put another content area within it. And any pages that inherit from the single column master page will then go ahead and just get this single column layout here. You can then go ahead and also take a look at double.master, and what we've done here is we've said inside the content page, we can go ahead and define two additional content areas, and now what we have is another master page, but in this case, it's actually defining a two-column layout. And you might not be realizing this, but basically what this is doing is this is enabling nested master pages. In Visual Studio 2005, you could do this. You could do this level of nesting and still get a rendering. But if you go ahead and go to a page like default.aspx, you'll notice that it's referencing that two-column master. What you could not do in Visual Studio 2005 is that if you had a page that was referencing a master page that then, in turn, was based on another master page, if you tried to switch to design view, you would pretty much get a big X or an error saying that Visual Studio is unable to render that. But with Visual Studio 2008, we support rendering of any level of nesting of master pages. So you can see here that basically this is using the two-column layout, and it's also displaying the rendering both from the double.master and the site.master that defines the top part and kind of the two columns. So really nice feature in terms of being able to get nested master pages within Visual Studio 2008. So the next thing we can take a look at is the new design surface and some of the CSS support in the design surface. So what I have here is basically a very simple document. All it has is an unordered list with some list elements in it. And basically what the list elements are, we can switch to design view and take a look at them, is an image tag and a title for that image tag. So if we go ahead and go to design view, you can see that basically we're just showing a list of images. And when you query something out of a database, typically all you're getting is a list. And in terms of how you want to represent that content in your document, you want to represent it as cleanly as possible and as elegantly as possible, which really is just an item of list, a list with some items in it. However, let's say you want to get a more tabular look and feel, so you want the images to kind of lay out in a horizontal and vertical table. You can go ahead and do that in several ways. You can create a table and create table rows and table columns and put individual images inside of those table rows and columns. But as soon as you start doing that kind of layout using HTML, what you're doing is you're basically intermingling your styling and layout information with the actual content of your document. And the most ideal way, actually, to do that kind of experience is to actually have an external style and an external layout that then goes ahead and applies CSS to this list element and lays this list out in a manner that you want in the page. And the nice benefit of that is that you have a very clean separation between your structure and your content and the actual styling of your elements of the content that's on your page. So what we can do is we can go ahead and use the design surface to apply some styling to this to get that nice tabular look and feel, but then in the end, still get the same structure in the document, so we're not actually modifying the original document, we're just applying external styles to the document to get the look and feel that we want. So if we go to design view, the first thing I want to show is the CSS properties window. And the CSS properties window is a very useful feature in two regards. One is, it lets you apply styles to your document. and to the elements in your document. But I think one of the more useful aspects of it is that it's a very useful tool for inspecting how styling is happening on your document. So because this was a static site template that I grabbed from somewhere else, it contains a lot of CSS and styling information that I might not be familiar with as a developer. If I go ahead and select some elements, you can see that the CSS property grid is showing me that there's a whole bunch of stuff, whole bunch of styles coming from a lot of different style sheets that are actually impacting or being selected on this particular element. I can go ahead and kind of hit escape to move out of the selection chain, so I can select the list, and then I can select the unordered list. And one thing that's really nice about this view is that we have this summary button up here. So if I go ahead and click the summary button, what that tells me now is exactly which styles are actually taking effect on this unordered list. So, the full view shows me everything I can set. The summary view actually shows me exactly what's being applied at this moment. So if I'm curious as to why there's a 15 pixel left margin, I can go ahead and click on the 15 pixel left margin. And you might notice as I did that it actually circled up here the style that is affecting that 15 pixel left margin. So if I can go ahead and hover over that, it even shows me what the definition of that style is. Let's say I actually want to go see where that's defined. I can just right click on it and say go to code, and it'll automatically take me to the place where the style is defined in the style sheet where it's defined in. So it's a very, very handy tool to actually know what's affecting this element, why is it rendering the way it is, and then where's the style coming from that's affecting that rendering. Another nice feature about that is that if I go ahead and look at this and go back to summary view, I might have defined a style that actually has a 0 pixel left margin, and I think I remember doing that. Why isn't this getting a 0 pixel left margin? If I go ahead and expand this, you can see that it also shows you things that have been overridden. So basically, it's showing that there was a style defined for a 0 pixel left margin, but it's being overridden by something else. And if I go ahead and hover over that, it actually tells me where it's being overridden. So it tells me that the single content UL rule is actually overriding this style that was applying to this element. So I know that that's something that, if you're using a lot of CSS, you sometimes just are wondering, why is this thing not rendering the way I want it to render? You can use the CSS property grid to see what things are being overridden in your style sheet here, and then go ahead and either remove the other style that's overriding it, or at least know why the behavior is the way it is. So that's a really useful tool. The other tool that I want to cover is the Manage Styles window. So the Manage Styles window basically gives me a list of all the styles that are available in terms of what's being linked into this page. So any style blocks that you've defined in your page will show up here. As well, any external style sheets that you have linked into the page will show up here. So you can see that basically it's showing site.css, it's showing reset.css, and it's showing demo.css as styles that are defined that are available inside of this page. If I click on any of these, it even gives me a quick little preview of what that style might look like at the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and create a new style. And we had already applied a class called PhotoList. I had done that previously. I could have done this at the beginning as well, to that unordered list. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create a selector for that PhotoList class. And I'm basically going to select list elements within the any class that has PhotoList applied to it. So I want to go ahead and define a style for list elements themselves. And then it asks, I can define where I want to create this style. And I'm just going to go ahead and create it in an existing style sheet that's linked in. And what that does is that we'll go ahead, and you can see in this style sheet now, it's just created a new style called PhotoList LI. So that's nice. I've kind of created the style that I want to use. And what I can do then is, let's go ahead and just select an LI element. Now, if I go back to the CSS property grid, I can go ahead and start styling stuff here, right? Just applying CSS styles, or I can even maybe size things directly. And if I'm doing that, it goes back to the point that I was talking about earlier, which is, how do I know what it's generating? Like if I set background color to blue, how do I know if it's generating an inline attribute on the LI, if it's generating an inline CSS style attribute, or if it's generating a style class and then applying it, or if it's generating something in an external file and applying it. And the way we give you control over that is this toolbar here called Style Application. So if you're familiar with CSS and you want control over how the styling gets applied, you can use the Style Application toolbar to get that very fine-grained control. It has two modes. It has an auto mode and a manual mode. If you leave it in the auto mode, it basically does what the designer thinks is the most optimal thing. So if there's already an external style applied to it, it'll probably write back to that external style. If there's no style that exists, it'll create an external class and apply a class to that element. But if you want to really control where everything's happening, you can then go ahead and put it in manual mode and pick the target rule that you want to get affected. So the designer knows that there's two different kinds of styles that are applying to LIs that we can persist to, two different rules. There's the rule that we just created, and there's an existing rule that was applying. Or you can tell it to go ahead and create new inline styles, or you can tell it to go ahead and apply kind of a class, create a new class and then apply it to the elements. So this gives you the control in terms of being able to pick exactly where the styling is going. So now if we go ahead and use the CSS property grid, and let's just go ahead and position this in a way so we can do the display to be inline instead of a block. And what that does is it basically allows all of the elements to butt up against each other. And then the other thing we can do is we can go ahead and say that we want to float each list element so that they float to the left of the other elements. So we can go ahead and set the float to the left. And now we can see that we're actually getting the kind of treatment that I was talking about in terms of getting a tabular layout. If we go ahead and go to the summary view, we can see that these new styles that I applied, because the style application was saying that it should go to photolist.li, you can see that those two styles that I set got persisted in the photolist.li CSS class. So it gives you the really powerful, flexible control of being able to use the design surface, but actually specify exactly how the code's going to get generated. A couple of other nice things we've done here is we've gone ahead and also given you control over margins and padding. So I can go ahead and kind of adjust the margins here. And as I'm adjusting those margins, basically it's using the same style application and it's applying them to the same photolist.li class that I created. And I'll go ahead and adjust the margins here so we can kind of get kind of a 10 pixel right and bottom margin. And you'll notice that the designer actually is then showing kind of a hatched background there to indicate that there's a margin around this element. And that's another nice feature. As you're selecting different elements, you can see whatever padding, I think padding's shown in green, and whatever margins are applied to a particular element. I think you saw that as well previously when I had the UL. You can see the left-hand side shows that there's a margin applied there. We'll go ahead and save this out and run it, and we can see kind of the final result of all the CSS styling we've done. So basically, it's now using that single column layout, and it's giving us kind of the nice tabular look for that list of items. But the really nice thing is that if I go ahead and go back to source, nothing's changed. I basically preserved the minimal structure and content for my document, but I was able to externally style it from a style sheet. So it allows you to kind of have optimal separation between kind of styling and layout and actually the content of your form itself. So that's a really nice feature there. So that's a quick look at the CSS stuff, and we'll keep moving along and actually go back to the slides and talk about data for a second. So working with data, I assume everyone here, if you're doing ASP.NET applications, spend a lot of time working with data. Querying data, manipulating data, displaying, presenting data, updating data. That's kind of the core of what applications, specifically web applications, do. Basically, there's some historical fun stuff to look at, like back in the 80s, kind of what data access looked like. It actually was, DBase had some pretty useful stuff. Like it actually let you, within the language, there were some features that you can do to go ahead and manipulate data in ways and kind of query and get different results back. from within the programming language. So it was definitely useful, but fairly limited. If you kind of move forward into the kind of ADO.NET era, you can see that we provided a lot more flexibility and a lot more power. But if you look at the code here, you can basically see that there's quite a lot of information about the database scattered within your code. So you're actually using field names from the database within your code. And if anyone's ever had a database schema changed while your application is developed, going back into the application and updating, F name to first name is quite a chore. So, having this kind of knowledge of the database in your code, although powerful, isn't necessarily the best way to program. And then I think more recently, the model that a lot of people are using to kind of help with that problem is an OR mapper or object to relational mapping. And what that allows you to do is kind of separate out your database knowledge from your application, so that basically you're mapping everything to objects, you're programming against those objects, and if the database fields change, that's fine as long as the mapping gets updated between your objects and your relational database. Your application won't have to go ahead and get updated. But there are still challenges around that space. How do you do kind of a object relational mapping from non-relational stuff? So how do you retrieve data from things like XML files, Active Directory, or the file system? There aren't really good technologies to do that today to kind of map those into objects. Or how can you just go ahead and use kind of data manipulation concepts against just plain old objects that are available in your application? And as you're doing that, how can you do it in a way that is optimized and fast? So you might have the ability to go ahead and query and manipulate your data in code, but are you really doing the optimal thing in terms of, are you killing your database as you're doing that because you're selecting all the records and then doing the manipulation in your code? That's typically not the way you want to write an application, because you want to make sure that the processing or the calculations and the query are actually happening where they're most performant, which is in the database. One of the technologies that's new in Visual Studio 2008 and in the .NET framework is LINQ, and it helps greatly with those problems. LINQ allows you to basically provides a set of transform, query, and set operations across objects. And it kind of makes querying a core concept in the programming language itself. And it does it in a way that's optimal, and we'll be seeing kind of how the code it generates under the covers is doing that. It also allows you to go ahead and integrate data from different places, so XML files, Active Directory, any kind of object that you want to do querying or transformations across. And then it's an integrated, because it's an integrated part of the .NET languages. It's available, in all the .NET languages that are supported out of the box in Visual Studio 2008. So let's go ahead and okay. So I'll talk about these and then we'll go to the demo. In addition to LINQ, some other things that ASP.NET provides around data access is a new control called the list view. You might be using existing controls like the data list or the grid view or the repeater. Each of them kind of has its advantages. If you use a grid view, it's very easy to get something up and running quickly, but the grid view inserts a lot of its own styling and kind of content information into the end result. So you're probably going to get a table layout with inline styles and a whole bunch of other stuff. So it's a little bit more of a black box in terms of not giving you as much control over what's getting outputted. The data list does more of that, but even then, I think it does create some structure around the data in terms of the repeating elements. And so you still don't have full control over what's being generated by your page. The way you achieve full control today is by using a repeater control. But if you've used a repeater control, you're probably familiar that it's not integrated with things like paging and updates, and it's not integrated well in the design surface. So if I'm using a repeater and I switch to design view, I really don't see any rendering. So what the list view does is it gives you kind of all of that, very, very specific control over the output of the data-bound content in terms of how it's going to render, but it gives you full support for features in the platform like paging, updating, editing, and it also gives you full support for the design surface. So if you're using a list view, you can actually get a rendering of what the data is going to look like in the design surface. Alongside the list view control, there's a new control called the data pager. And the data pager basically allows you to apply paging to any data-bound ASP.NET control, and it gives you full control over the paging behavior. So you can fully template how you want paging to work and use the data pager to do that, and I'll be showing that as well. And then finally, there's a linked data source, and the linked data source enables you to go ahead and data bind to an object relational, what we call a link to SQL data layer that you might have created in your application. So let's go ahead and switch back to the demo machine and take a look at how Link works and how those new controls work with Link. So what I want to do now is I'll go ahead and integrate some data into this application. And the first thing I want to do is I want to show the new OR mapper that's available in Visual Studio 2008. What we call that is Link to SQL. We're using that nomenclature to kind of talk about the different mappings that are available around Link. So there'll be Link to XML, Link to whatever mapping that we provide, whatever designers that we provide. In Visual Studio 2008, there's a Link to SQL mapper, so it actually allows you to map to relational data in SQL. We'll go ahead and call this object Northwind, and we'll go ahead and add that to our project. So what we're doing now is we're basically adding an object relational mapping into our application, and it's going to add a new design surface here that allows me to go ahead and define objects that then I can go ahead and map into database items. I can use this kind of from either approach. So I can go ahead and start kind of modeling my objects directly. So I can go ahead and start putting classes in, putting fields in, and putting kind of associations or relationships between those objects in the design surface. Or I can take the alternative approach and start with the database and then model the database in the design surface. So you can take either approach depending on kind of how you're starting your application. And in this case, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and take a look at this SQL Express database that I have in the project, which is Northwind. And we'll go ahead and model the objects based off of the tables that are available in this database. So we're going to go and just, to start off, we'll start very simple. We'll select a product table and a categories table. And so what I'm doing now is I basically have in my model now modeled kind of two tables or two objects here, one called product and one called category. The other thing that the design surface has done for me is that it's actually detected that there's an association between the two. So it actually detects that the two tables or the two objects have an association. If I look at that association, you can kind of see that here that basically it's mapping the category ID between product and category, and you can kind of see that it's a one-to-many association. You'll also see that then there's basically a child property on the category object that lets me navigate to products, and similarly there's a parent property on the product object that lets me navigate to its categories. So when we go ahead and save this out and see what it generates, we can see those associations in the classes it'll generate as well. So we'll save that out, and let's just go back. And when I did that, basically what it did is it generated those objects in code for me. And if I go inspect that, I can see that there's a designer-generated file here that's generating those objects. So we can take a look at what it generated, and it basically is generating three classes. It's generating a class for a data context, and the data context basically defines how to populate those objects from the database. So it contains information about the database and how the mapping occurs between the database and the objects. And then all it basically we have here is just two simple objects. We have a product object and a category object, and if we just inspect one of these, you can see that it's basically got fields like product ID, and I think if we go further down, we can see that it'll have a a field here that is going to be basically a category. So within the product class, it's actually also has a category field that then will get populated with the category associated with that particular product. So how do we go ahead and use this? Let's jump back to our application and start off with some simple examples and build it up from there. So I've got a page here called link. Very simple, so we're going to start off very simple and just kind of build on top and kind of adding concepts to see how it works. So all I have here is a grid view, and we're going to go ahead and do some link operations and then display data in that grid view. For simplicity's sake, I'm going to go ahead and write my code in the page. Typically, you're not going to be writing data access code like this. You'd want to write it in a data layer or in a separate class, but I'm just going to do it here so that we can quickly walk through it. I'm going to create a function called bindData that's going to basically be the place where we define the data transformations before we bind it. So let's go ahead and start off by creating a new data context. So we're going to create that Northwind data context that I talked about. And we'll use that to kind of populate the objects into the query that we're going to generate. So we're just going to go ahead and create a new query. And we're basically going to say from P in db.product, so from that data context, which is the Northwind database, let's go ahead and get the products table. And we're just going to go ahead and select P. So what this is saying is in the link syntax is basically doing the query from products and then selecting all the products in that query. So things now that you can do is, for instance, you can do like for each product P in query. Let's go ahead and see we can basically see that we're getting IntelliSense against that variable that is now going to get the results of that query. And to start off simple, what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and take the result that we have here and data bind it to that grid. So we're just going to do grid view 1, and then we're just going to set the data source to that query object, and we'll go ahead and data bind it as well. Let me see if I typed that correctly, actually. Yeah, I was missing a capitalization. So let's just go ahead and run this. What we'll see now is that, oh, sorry. So what we'll see now is that it's basically doing a link query, and it's taking the results from that link query and just binding it into our grid view. What we're seeing is that we're getting back about 70-odd products, and we're getting back all the columns in the product database, or the product table. What links lets me do then is go ahead and transform that data so that I'm selecting actually what I want to display on that grid. So we can do things like where p dot category ID equals 1. And if we go ahead and do that and rerun the page, what we'll see now is that it's giving me only the products where the category ID is 1. So we can use that query syntax to go ahead and filter the results. We can also do nice things like, because we have those associations in our data layer, we can go ahead and do things like where p dot, we can go ahead and navigate the association, so we can go to the category, and we can say category name equals beverages. So we can go ahead and also navigate the associations between the tables and then define kind of a query syntax to select stuff like that. If we go ahead and run that now, we can see now that it's basically doing the same thing, but it's using a different syntax to do that select. Well, so you're looking at this, and you might be thinking, well, is this just killing my database? So this code that I wrote here, is it just going to go ahead and select, every time I run that, is it going to go ahead and select all the products and then do some manipulation in code to go ahead and then filter down to this list and then pass it off to the grid view? And that's absolutely what you don't want to happen. You want to make sure that the database is doing the query, and that's giving you the nice results. So even though you have the nice kind of integrated programming concept to do the transformation here, you want the database to actually do the query so that it's handling the computation, not your middle tier. One of the nice things is we can go ahead and actually inspect what Link's doing under the covers by just debugging this application. So we'll go ahead and debug this application. And what we'll see now is basically what's going to happen under the covers as this application runs. So if I go here, you can basically see that this is the query that Link's generated. And under the covers, it's basically generating an optimal query so that the database is only selecting the particular data that's defined in the Link statement above. So the Link provider is pretty good at doing this, and I don't know SQL too well, but when I look at these queries and I kind of like look at what's being done, obviously it's optimal, and if you really, really do care about how the querying is happening, you can go ahead and overwrite this query with any query that you think is more optimal for this particular scenario. So even though it'll generate an optimal query for you and make sure the computation is happening in the database, the developer has the flexibility to go overwrite the SQL to be whatever they want if they believe that there's a tweak that they need to make. Great, so another thing that Link lets me do is kind of transform the data. So we're doing kind of different query operations in here. We can also transform the data so that it represents a shape that is what we want to display to the user, is the shape that we want to get back. So what we can do is, instead of selecting P, we can go ahead and select what we want to define as the shape of the data. So we can just say, let's just move this breakpoint here for a second, and I'll make some room so people can see. What we'll do is we'll go ahead and select a new, and what we'll define here is we'll just go ahead and select ID. And so what you can see here is that I'm actually renaming the field to ID instead of product ID. So I can go ahead and rename the fields to shape them the way I want, and then we can go ahead and select name, and we can see that that'll be p.product name. One of the things that's nice here then is if you do, I think this will work here. Let's see if this works. You can see now that I haven't typed that p here. I basically just created an untyped variable, var p, but the language is smart about actually knowing what that object's populated with, so I'm getting the actual typed information, so I can see that I'm getting the ID and name as the things that are going to get populated in that query object. So some really nice dynamic stuff in terms of dynamically being able to understand what's going to be available in that query object, and then giving you the right intel sense against that. So I changed the name to ID and name, and you can see here that all it's making available to me in that query object is ID and name. So we can go ahead and then let's just run this again and see what it gives us. What it's going to give us now is kind of the data shaped more in a way that we want to display. It's using the right field names that we want to use, because I didn't want to use the product ID and product name field names, so I renamed them, and it's selecting back only the data that I want. Let's go ahead and then also see some other things that you can do. So you can kind of shape the data like this. You can also do some nice things in terms of being able to compute data or kind of create computed columns to display different kinds of data also. So what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and kind of add some more complexity to our model. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that Northwind model that we had created earlier. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and add a couple of other things into that model. So I'll add basically the orders table. And I'll also add the order details table. So what you can see now is this is basically just going to create a few more objects for me, and it also creates a few more relationships. So now from a given product, I can actually see all the order details that are referencing that particular product. I can also then, in this OR mapper, just change the names that are defaulted. So if I don't like any of the names that are created in the model, I can go ahead and rename them to whatever I want. So both in Link, you can transform the data, but also in the OR designer here, you can name things, and you can name the objects any way you prefer to name them so that they're available that way. So I can go ahead and say that I don't like order underscore detail. I can just make it order detail, and that'll basically then be the shape of the data, the model that gets generated. So now that I've generated that, we can go ahead and save it, and we can do some more complex stuff in terms of being able to query stuff in LINQ. So what we can do here now is, like, let's say we want to get the number of orders for a particular product. So we can create a new field called numOrder, and we can basically do, go get all the order details, and we can just get a count of them. So we can just say, okay, for all the order details that are associated with this product, just give me a count. And so when we've done that, we can go ahead and run it again. And what we'll see now is that not only is it showing me the ID and the name, but it's also showing me the number of orders that are available for that particular product, because it has that relationship mapped back into the model. I can also do some even more complex things like calculate revenue. So I can do that by looking at all the order details, and then I can basically sum up, and then I can do an inline expression here. It's called a lambda expression. And I can just say, let's get the unit price, and let's go ahead and multiply that by the quantity. So now I'm able to basically, for every single order detail, I'm basically multiplying the unit price and the quantity, and then I'm taking the sum of all of those and then applying that to the revenue column. So if we go ahead and do that and save it, hit refresh here, we can see now that we're able to do fairly complex stuff using the query language within our programming language, within VB and C# to kind of manipulate and transform the data to have it select exactly what I want, and then have that go ahead and be used as my binding for the control. So that's really nice. The other nice thing here is that you can also go ahead and do updates. So what I'll do is well, before I go there, one of the things about the OR mapper here is that it's generating some classes for you. And what you might want to do is go ahead and customize that model with some specific information that you want to add, maybe adding your own fields, or adding your own logic that you want associated with this particular model that gets generated. Because what it's generating is a partial class, you can go ahead and generate a partial class and add additional customization to that model that then the designer will never overwrite, because the designer is always going to overwrite the designer.cs file. Any information that you put in the partial class will be preserved by Visual Studio. So let's just go ahead and add some behavior to that model. And what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and, let's see, in app code, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and create a new class. And we'll call that class product. And that's basically going to be the other half of the partial class that was generated by the model. So we're going to go ahead and create this product class. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and make it a partial class. And what we can then do is we can go ahead and define a, we can go ahead and then define a partial method to handle some validation for that model. So in my data layer, let's say I want to validate products, and I want to actually add some rules about what's allowed and what's not allowed for the product model. I can go ahead and do that here. So I can go ahead and do an onValidate and implement that. And what we'll see, let's just get rid of this. We don't need that. What we'll see now is that instead of throwing an exception, we can actually add some validation here. So we can basically say if this dot product name equals, let's just use cherry, then, actually I don't need to do that. We can basically then say, let's throw a new exception, and we'll just say something like no cherries allowed in the product. So basically, now I'm defining some validation for this model. Oh, sorry. Was that what I was missing a quote? Okay, all right. So basically, I've added some validation here. So I can go ahead and extend the model by using a partial class, adding my own fields, adding my own behavior to that particular data model. And because I'm doing it in a partial class, as I'm adjusting that model in the design surface, the designer class that it's generating isn't going to override the data layer behavior that I'm adding here. So we can go ahead and save that out. And let's go ahead and what we'll do is we'll just add some update capabilities into the grid view that we were generating here. So simply to do that, what I'm going to do is add a button. So we'll just add a button control in here. And what I want to do is, when I click that button, I just basically want to insert some products into the database. So I can go ahead and what I'll do is, because we have that nice model, I can do the inserts in kind of a interesting way. So I can go ahead and create a category, and we'll just call it C1, and we'll just go ahead and create a new category. So and then we'll give that a name, and we'll just use I think berries as a category. And then we can go ahead and create some new products as well. So we'll go ahead and create a new product, and we'll call that P1. And we'll set its product name to, let's just say strawberry. I think there's a couple of other required fields like unit price and probably discontinued as well. And what we want to do now is we'll just go ahead and create 2 of these, just so we have a couple of products. And we'll call this one P2. And we'll change the name of this one to, let's just say blueberry. So what I've done here is I've basically just created a couple of new products and a new category. I also want to go ahead and then just associate those products. So we can just go ahead and add those products to this category that we created. So we're just going to go ahead and add P1, and we'll just go ahead and add P2 as well. And so now what I've done is I basically created a new category, created 2 new products, associated those products as part of that new category I created. And I can then simply just submit that category into the database, and it'll also submit the products because they're associated with the category. So we'll just go ahead and create that data context. And we'll basically say DB, and we'll just go to the categories, and we'll say insert on submit, and we'll basically just insert C1, and then we'll just submit the changes. So what we've done here is we basically said that for that data context, insert this new object that we created, and then submit it. And that also will then insert the products, because the products are associated with that category. And then we can go ahead and call bind data again, and that'll just bind our grid so we can see the result. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and simplify some of the results set here. And I'm going to basically change this to berries. So we basically only see the products that are being returned by category berries. So when we do that, what we should see now is that basically you're going to see nothing to start with. Because there's no categories defined as berries. If I go ahead and insert that, you can see that it's now inserting that using the code I wrote. If I go ahead and say, let's call one of these products cherry, and we'll save that out. So refresh this. You can see now that it did that insert, and basically you got the exception. Obviously, you'd handle this kind of exception in a better way to give a better experience to the user. But the point being that you can define your validation in your data layer, and no matter how your data is being updated, whether it's through a web page, whether it's through a web service, whether it's through several different pages, you'll have that validation get applied in a single place, and you don't have to define it in many different places. So you can really model the data the way you want and get that to kind of work across your application. We'll kind of go back and just make this blueberry again. One of the things that I actually skipped over that I'll kind of jump back to really quickly is you can also implement server-side paging using kind of link, and I'll show how to do that as well. So let's go ahead and save this out, and let's just go back to using beverages, and I'll show how server-side paging works. So we'll save that. Let's go ahead and run it again. And what this basically lets you do inside of Link is go ahead and implement server-side paging. So you can see that, actually what I want is everything. There. So we can basically see a large result set here. So we can see that it's returning everything here. What we want to do now is we want to basically just implement something where it's going to page those elements based on where it's coming back from the database. So I can go ahead and do something simple like just wrap the entire query in a function here and just say take, and we can just go ahead and use the take function and say I want to take 10. And what this will do is it'll just basically have Link take the first 10 of the result set and return that back. So if I run that, we can see that it's only grabbing 10 out of the database. And then what I can do is, let's say I want to go ahead and actually implement some kind of paging. I can just go ahead and specify a start row. And we'll just convert that to int32, so we're always ensured of getting a value. And we'll just use the query string. And in the query string, I'm just going to use a start row to help select that item. And what I'm doing now is basically saying that, okay, there's a query string variable. And so what I can do now is, instead of just taking 10 from that query, I can also then go ahead and say skip. I can basically skip to a particular part in the result set. And I can just say start row. And then I can say take 10. I noticed that the result set wasn't returning ordered IDs, so it might not be as effective because you might not see how it's jumping ahead, but we can still go ahead and kind of just show that as you're picking a different start row, it goes ahead and returns a different result set. So what this is doing, though, is it's actually implementing server-side paging. So once again, the question kind of arises, is this just killing my database? Like, if I'm doing paging like this, is this just going to select everything every time this page runs? And no, Link is actually implementing a query, if you're using SQL Server 2005 or higher, that is optimized and uses server-side paging in SQL Server. So to see that, we can actually go ahead and once again debug this. And when we're debugging this, we can see basically kind of what's being selected here. So you can see that it's doing a select top 10, which basically tells SQL Server only to select 10 out of the result set. And if we go ahead and run it again and actually have it do the start row, refresh here. There. So we can see now that it's actually generating a query here where it says select row number over, and basically is using, I think I'm not using the start row right here. Yeah. So it's basically generating the right query here as well in terms of just selecting the right amount of stuff from the database. That doesn't look right to me though. Let me actually run it again. Just make sure that. Here we go. Now you'll see it. Yeah, there we go. Actually, still not seeing that there. That's interesting. Did I spell that correctly? Okay. There's definitely some kind of syntax here, but basically what the query will generate is a query that's only going to select, starting at that row, selecting 10. So it does use server-side paging if you're using SQL Server 2005 or higher. If you're using SQL Server 2000, you can still do server-side paging. You just have to write a little bit more code. That's Link. One of the new things that we also have in ASP.NET is the ability to go ahead and create a data layer like I did for the categories and products, and then go ahead and use that data layer and bind it to ASP.NET controls using the link data source controls. So what I'm going to do is just real quickly, we're kind of out of time, but I'm just going to kind of show one last thing if people are interested, which is the new list view control and kind of how that works. So on the list view control, basically, we'll go ahead and go back to our products table here. And the point earlier was that you won't typically display data like this. This is static representation of the data. You might get a start representation of your application like this. But a tabular layout like this is most likely going to be populated from the database. So what we can do is we can go ahead and use the list view control to get the same kind of rendering, and then use the link data source to go ahead and select the data and bind it to the list view control. So we'll take a look at the list view control first. We'll just go ahead and add a list view here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to define two things. I'm going to define a layout template, and I'm going to define an item template. And basically, the layout template defines kind of the outer layout of your rendering, and the item template defines the repeating section within that outer layout. So for the layout template, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and copy the outer tag that I want to use. And this can be any content. I'm just going to use the one that we've already defined. And I'll put that here. And then I'll go ahead and also put the ending tag. And then one other thing that you need to do is you basically need to add a placeholder that defines where the content's going to get repeated inside of this layout. So I'm just going to create this placeholder here, and I need to call it, I believe it's item placeholder is the ID that I need. So I've gone ahead and created a placeholder in here. And then for the item template, we're just going to go and repeat these items within the list view. So we'll grab that out, and we'll just add it into the item template. And what I want to do now is I'll go ahead and define what parts of this I want to data bind. So we'll go ahead and get that. And kind of in the interest of time, I won't use the link query. I'll just use the link data source control. But you could also use the link query here and just bind that query directly to the list view like I've been doing with the grid view. But you can also use the link data source control, which then just lets you bind your data layer that's defined directly. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead and add a link data source as well. And then what we can do is, in design view, we can go ahead and configure that link data source to give us the rendering that we want. So that's interesting. Oh, I need to delete all of these. I was wondering why that was showing up. So you can see one thing immediately is the list view control kind of gives me the rendering that I'm going to get based on kind of how the list view is configured. So it's using that layout template and then item template to give me the rendering in the design view. I can then go ahead and go to the link data source and configure the data source. And we can go ahead and use any data context that's defined. And then we can go ahead and use any of the objects that we defined in our data layer. So we'll go ahead and grab the products table. And in the interest of not displaying too much data, we'll go ahead and also specify a filter for that. And we can use the query string for filtering it. And we'll give it a default value, so we only get products back for a particular category. So now that I've done that, I can basically then go to my list view control and select the list view here. And in the list view control, I can, for the data source, I can just go ahead and specify that link data source that I configured. And And so if I go ahead and run this now, it's basically going to go ahead and use that data layer that I specified, but bind it to that data list. Oh, all right, I'm definitely missing some stuff here. I have no data specified in my list view. So it's not going to like that. So let's go back to this, and one thing I do need to add is some actual reference to data. So what I want to do is, out of the database, I want to go ahead and grab the product ID and use that for the image. So we'll go ahead and eval the product ID here. And then the other thing I want to do is go ahead and replace this with the actual product name. So we'll go ahead and eval the product name here. Excuse me? I wasn't clear what you were asking. Line 29 here. That's fine. I gave it a default value, so it'll still select. That's fine. Thanks for pointing that out, though. So let's go ahead and save that, and now let's run it, and we'll actually see the content it generates. So basically now we took that unordered list and we bound it to the data layer that I created earlier, and we're using the list view control to display it. So you might be looking at this and say, okay, well, I can kind of do this with a repeater. What's really nice here? Basically the list view control gives you full control over the generated content. So you can see that, really all I'm getting is the stuff that I defined in the templates. I'm not getting any extra attributes. I'm not getting any extra IDs. I'm not getting any extra style information. So definitely gives you that full control over how you want your data rendered. So the list view control is really useful for that. But the benefit of it is that, things like if I go to design view, I actually see what the repeat section is going to look like. If I was using a repeater, I would never see this. I would just see a little gray box showing me, I can't render this in the design view. The other nice thing about this is that you can go ahead and use paging with it as well. You had to kind of manually do paging with the repeater. The new data pager control allows you to go ahead and do paging across controls like the list view. So just to show that quickly, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and grab a data pager, and we'll just add that. I'm trying to see where I should add. We'll just add it to the bottom. I'll copy it out. We'll add it to the top, actually. And what the data pager lets me do is it lets me go ahead and page any other data-bound control on my page. So I'll go ahead and say, I'll just use a class that I had defined earlier called pager. And then also what I'll do is I'll basically go ahead and specify some fields that I want to show for paging. And there's several things you can pick from. You can basically kind of do a next back kind of paging. You can do a numeric paging. And then you can do a templated paging where you can templatize the entire page control so you can get the paging to look exactly the way you want if you're not wanting to use either of those. I'll just use a numeric pager. And the nice thing about the numeric pager is that it just outputs numbers. It doesn't output any styling or anything else. And because I've got this class applied, I can just then manipulate those. It's actually outputting hrefs with just simple numbers in the href. And then I can go ahead and apply a CSS class to those hrefs and get the kind of nice display that I want for those numbers. So we can go ahead and run that now and see that. Actually, before I run it, there's a couple things that I'm missing. So one is I do need to define which control I'm paging. So we can go ahead and for the data pager, do a couple of things. We can go ahead and change the control that I'm paging to be list view 1. And then another thing I want to do is I just want to go ahead and limit the page size so we can actually see some paging. So I'll limit it to 6. And then we'll run this. So we can see now that with that list view control, we were able to very quickly add paging as well. And that's another thing that you could not do with the repeater. But the list view gives you the really, really nice control over what gets generated, but it also participates well in things like paging and editing and updating. People are probably also familiar with AJAX. A couple of things that we've done around there. We basically integrated ASP.NET AJAX directly into the framework. So you had to download it as a separate download or add-on to ASP.NET 2.0. You don't have to do that anymore. You can just go ahead and install ASP.NET 3.5, and that has AJAX built in. And you might notice that if I'm we can basically see that the paging here adds some flash. That's a little weird. This happened to me before as well. I think I might have something weird with the server. But basically what the update panel lets me do is if I surround any of the elements here with an update panel, it'll give me a kind of a nice behavior in terms of not refreshing the entire page when it runs. I'm not sure what's going on. Oh, it's just slow. So you can see, like kind of the entire page refreshes as I'm paging there. But if I go ahead and use the update panel control, I can go get a behavior where only this section here is going to update and the rest of the page does not. So we can go ahead and kind of add a, okay. So there's a rehearsal coming in. I did want to just kind of run over and cover more features from part 2, and I'm well into part 2. The only other feature that I didn't cover is kind of JavaScript IntelliSense and IIS, but I thank you for sticking around and seeing the rest of the session. So if you have any questions, feel free to, yeah, absolutely. Thanks.